Welcome everyone for the SETA DC panel. This is one of the book talks that we have. And today we have Michael Pembroke with us and his book, America in Retreat, The Decline of US Leadership. Thank you, Michael, for being with us today. And it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I have a lot of questions. Probably our audience will have a lot of questions. For those participants on the Zoom and those who are following us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, please write your question. If you are on Zoom, write to the question and answer box. If you are following through social media, please write your comment as question. My assistants will collect those questions and we will direct those questions to Michael. And since we have limited time and such a big time difference, I just want to start with the book. Michael, it's a great book. And my first question, why this book? Why now?
Well, Kilic, this book actually arose out of my previous book. I don't know whether you've seen it. It was published in America. It's called Korea, Where the American Century Began. It was published about 3 years ago. And I didn't know a lot about the Korean War until I started to research for that book. I was really motivated by a desire to understand a particular battle in which my father fought as a junior platoon commander. But as I learned more and more, I wanted to understand the wider context and why the war took place and why it was extended for such a long time. And it became apparent to me that all of the mistakes of Vietnam and Iraq and subsequent conflicts and interventions over the last 75 years all had their origin in the way the United States led the conduct of the Korean War. They often say it was a coalition, but the US troops represented 95% of the overall force. And the US commanders were in total control, and Allied commanders or other partner commanders had to do what they were told. And what alarmed me, there were several things which alarmed me. One is that this was 1950, only 5 years after the bombing of many Japanese cities and the disintegration of those cities using the type of bombs that would spread fire and were designed to cause as much civil destruction as possible. And only 5 years after the bombing of the German cities. So there was a great debate going on in the world at that time about whether there should be some constraint on the continued use of massive bombing of civilian cities and civilians. And unknown to almost everyone, because there was no television in Korea, not like Vietnam, the United States engaged in the most broad-scale bombing campaign that you could imagine. And US reports and statements by Americans in the field said that every brick standing on another brick was destroyed. Every city, every town, every industrial center. Pyongyang was, like many other cities in North Korea, has been rebuilt from scratch. So I began to be very concerned about overreach and the too ready use of wide-scale bombing. And then I became, I was very curious as to understand why that war took so long. You see, it started off as a civil war in effect. The Americans had made the decision to divide the Korean Peninsula in 1945. When the war started in June 1950, the North Koreans were attempting to reunite the peninsula. It was a close-run thing between whether the North Koreans would start the hostilities or the South Koreans, but the North Koreans did so first, and they had the benefit of Russian tanks, which had been given to them by Stalin. Well, the UN Security Council resolution authorized the use of UN forces to restore peace and security at the border, at the 38th parallel. Mm-hmm. That was achieved within 3 months. By September 1950, the primary goal of the United Nations Security Council had been achieved. But what happened was, and this is such a lesson for the future, President Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, were not prepared to stop at the 38th parallel. So having complained about the North Koreans crossing the 38th parallel heading south, they had no compunction about crossing the parallel heading north. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to exercise regime change on Pyongyang. Mm-hmm. It was blatant, and it was a naked attempt to interfere with the sovereignty of a foreign nation. Mm-hmm. So instead of finishing there, the US-led forces pushed forward into North Korea and went all the way to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea. China had nothing to do with the war at this stage, but it had warned the Americans not to approach or not to cross the 38th parallel, and certainly not to approach their border. Well, when they did, China finally entered the war. The result was the greatest and longest retreat in US military history. The Chinese pushed them back even further below the 38th parallel from where they started. It was an embarrassment. And so those two factors, both representing a sort of overreach, and there were other factors, made me conceive the title Where the American Century Began, because it was the beginning of this long period of sort of purported military supremacy and constant intervention and failure to recognize the sovereignty of individual nations. And it led me to think, well, I'd like to write a wider book addressing that topic. And the fundamental tenet of the new book, America in Retreat, is that the first principle of the UN Charter, of which the United States was the leading proponent, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt can take credit for that, was that every nation must respect the sovereignty of every other nation. Mm-hmm. It's something that, coincidentally, the Chinese keep repeating back to the Americans. And it seems to me that the Americans only ever paid lip service to that first principle. Indeed, as early as 1948, 3 years after the UN Charter, the Americans tried once again quite blatantly to interfere in the Italian general election because they were concerned that by the democratic processes in the Italian Republic, the people would elect a communist government. Mm-hmm. And my approach is, and I think the approach of most civilized people, is that you can have whatever government you wish. It's not for other countries to interfere and to try to overturn the governments of sovereign countries. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Kilic.
No, that was that was really good. And there is this question now. There was this it was around 2010, 2011. There was this massive amount of emerging literature on American decline. You also cited some of those. You cited Farid Zekeria's book, The Post-American World. And there were some other books. You cited Thomas Friedman multiple times. His book That Used to Be Us, one of them, in those days, many people established what some neoconservatives used to call declinist scholarship. Right?
Yes.
So, and in 2016, 2017, we start, and those books, the main idea of those books was the crumbling infrastructure in the US, the economic decline, the Iraq war is leading to a post-American world, right? And in 2016, 2017, we see another group of books emerging, like people from Mersheimer, people from like Stephen Walt, who argue that the liberal international order is in threat right now, under the threat of United States actually right now. And it was mostly about the loss of credibility on the part of the US. So when I got your book, and when you are talking to your readers, for example, what is different in this book that wasn't in that scholarship in 2010, or the books that was written on international order in 2016 and 17?
Well, frankly, there's nothing I have said that hasn't been said before. But the message is not getting across.
Okay.
So I mean, perhaps I've gone back a little more to demonstrate that the roots of the modern problem began as early as 75 years ago, shortly after World War II, and that there's been a continuous trend with some dips and peaks along the way, but it's all been one way. There's been constant militarism, which has been part and parcel of the American culture, and which the rest of the world finds difficult to understand, frankly. I've mentioned, and everyone knows, that the US military and intelligence budget approaches $1 trillion a year, and is about is more than the next 9 countries combined. It's just, and that sort of approach to world affairs just generates resentment and creates more trouble. It's not solving problems.
There is this argument from the, if we can say, anti-declinist, like the observers, journalists, and scholars, who say this America is in decline is a story that has been said so many times before. During the Vietnam War, there was a debate that, even before Vietnam War, actually, when Sputnik was sent to the space, there was many argument and anxiety among the Americans that America is losing the space war and it will lead to a decline. And then after the Vietnam War and Watergate scandals, this is the end of America. And in 2010, we had this argument again, this is the end of the unipolar world. This is the end of unipolar moment. Why do you think we should now discuss American decline again? Because it happened so many times, and there was a really relative decline, but United States kept staying as the superpower in the world. Why now?
I was in America at the time of Watergate, or shortly before or after that time. There was no serious competitor. We had the Cold War, of course, we had Soviet Russia, but the difference now is that China has become quite clearly a peer competitor, an equal player on the world stage, and is adopting a different approach to global affairs. Now, I'm not an apologist for any country, but but for 75 years, the United States has tried to export its democratic capitalist model. China does not want to export its ideology. It's not interested in doing that. It's simply, and it doesn't send invasion forces around the world. In fact, it's the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping forces. It doesn't intervene in the affairs of foreign states. And that includes, because there's a lot of misconception about this, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Hong Kong is the sovereign territory of China, and it claims Taiwan in the same category. And frankly, whether or not there's conflict in Taiwan is too hypothetical to consider at the moment. I think it's probably unlikely for some considerable time. So what's happened now is that there is a serious player who is the equal of and a peer competitor of the United States, and that's the difference. And through the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, there are many, many countries among the 193 member countries of the United Nations who benefit from Chinese economic investment, and development. Countries in Africa, across Asia, countries in Central and South America. So we have a hardening core in Europe and North America and Australasia, but we represent a minority of the world's population. So I've mentioned in the book that the population of China is, as everyone knows, about 1.4 billion people. That's 4 times the population of the United States. It's almost double the population of the West, consisting of the United Kingdom, Western Europe, North America, Australasia, and I think that covers them. So, you know, it's a question of scale, of population, of power, of economic control. These are the factors that are different now compared to the early 1970s when I was in America during the Watergate crisis. They represent a real choice for many countries in the world.
There is, you just mentioned the favorable views about China around the world, but the Pew Research recently, I think October 6, 2020, released a report saying that unfavorable views of China reach historic highs in many countries, especially during the COVID crisis. Yeah. And we see a dramatic decline across the world, both actually about the United States, because United States favorability was record low in this period as well. And actually the previous report of Pew Research showed that the favorability of US and then China is also going all-time low. So it shows that it may not, you know, it may not be a zero-sum game here, that both superpowers are actually suffering very low favorability for different reasons.
Quite different reasons. I mean, the Chinese have adopted an unwise diplomatic policy, which is aggressive, and they have made a lot of people unhappy about that, especially in my country. But you know, the United States chose in 2017 to effectively, for all intents and purposes, go to war with China, except by military means. The national security strategy and the national defense strategy named China as a strategic enemy. It was unnecessary. They are economic competitors. They're not strategic enemies. And that is at the moment sort of affecting the world. It's resulted in China becoming extremely defensive and angry, and taking it out on countries that support the United States, like Australia, and it's resulted in the United States wasting so many resources in fighting a war that it doesn't need to fight. China has not the slightest intention of waging a war with the United States. It doesn't have any intention of being involved in some ideological struggle, just like we had in the Cold War. It's for some Chinese at the top, the current situation is bemusing, and they're annoyed by it.
So, you know that right now the one of the, I think, the challenging period for U.S.-China relations in their history. And you criticized President Trump's position in 2017. Now, Secretary Blinken announced, when he was announcing the national security strategy, actually, he mentioned that in quote, our relationship with China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Does this fit to you as a more rational strategy than the previous one?
Yes, it's much more rational, and everything about the Biden-Blinken approach to foreign policy is more intelligent and more satisfactory. There is, however, a concern on my part and others as well that the both Biden and Blinken still see the world in terms of sort of American global supremacy, military and in other ways. I'm sorry about those pings on my computer. I have to turn something off. Okay.
So again, another question that in the second part of the book, you mentioned after skipping the history, of course, I will have some questions about the history, especially the US support for the military coups that you mentioned, etc. But you mentioned two things, the militarism and unilateralism. And in unilateralism part, there's a quote from Joe Biden, actually, when he was a senator, right? At that time, about the militarization first. Joe Biden, you said Joe Biden lamented the migration of functions and authorities from the civilian agencies to the Department of Defense. Then you are talking about the increasing militarization of US foreign policy. And this was a constant criticism. Former State Department officials also criticized US foreign policy for being too militaristic, using the military instruments too liberally sometimes, and even the sanctions too liberally. So now Joe Biden is the president. Since he is aware of this challenge in US foreign policy, do you expect a change in the trajectory of the retreat of the United States?
I think there might be. I think more people will come back to the State Department, and many people left in the time of President Trump. I think Blinken and Biden both reflect a desire to see more diplomacy and less resort to the Defense Department and its resources.
I received a question about this. Is you mentioned you have a Russia part actually, but they are asking about the recent crisis between Ukraine and Russia. And do you think US has anything to do with this crisis, or do you think US can play a more constructive role in the Ukrainian-Russia crisis right now?
Well, I can't remember whether I said this, but it is the view of many commentators, and I share it, that the greatest mistake that the United States has committed in relation to Russia was to engage in the constant expansion of NATO from the 1990s under
You actually mentioned this in page 136. It's in my notes.
You've read the book more recently than I have. And so the NATO forces are now closer to Moscow than they have ever been before when there was a Cold War. So Russia, one of the reasons why Russia, and perhaps the principal reason why Russia moved so quickly into the Ukraine, was its concern about the proximity of the NATO forces and the possibility of American influence being so close to its borders. But there were other reasons. I mean, historically, as you know, the Black Sea ports belonged to Russia for centuries, and it was an anomaly that that they didn't control that part of the world.
I think both sides. I think United States and Russia is trying to de-escalate right now, because it was just announced that United States decided not to send those warships to Black Sea. And they decided to stop that process right now. Another question about the militarism. Somebody is asking, he didn't put a name on it, but how about China's flexing its muscles militarily, especially in South China Sea and behind? And they are also spending so much money, and it is not even transparent about their military.
Well, China doesn't spend anywhere near as much money as the United States, and we can be fairly reliably confident about that. They've flexed their muscles in the sense that they have exerted a certain amount of territorial control in the South China Sea, which is historically what they've always done. When they were moving out to Xinjiang 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, they would move out there, they'd build forts and garrisons, they'd bring out colonists and settlers, and they would start to slowly occupy those territories. It was done in 2,000 years ago to keep out the nomadic hordes, the Zhongzhu they were, who are said to be ancestors of the Uyghurs. This is the same thing. China has been very upset for a long, long time about the fact that the United States has such a huge presence in the Western Pacific with nuclear missiles and warheads pointed at it. So Guam, as we all know, is a hotbed of nuclear weapons. In Japan, Okinawa, there are huge quantities of American forces. They're not supposed to have nuclear warheads there, and I don't know whether they do or not. The same applies in South Korea. The bases in South Korea and in Okinawa are all relics of World War II, but they have been maintained ever since for purposes for which they were not originally established. And there's no wonder that North Korea is edgy, because it has 83 US bases and installations in South Korea, which are a constant threat to its peace and security. I don't think that situation will last forever, although it certainly won't, the bases won't be disbanded quickly. And I don't see Biden even addressing that issue.
How about China's military expansion in South China Sea? The question was particularly on South China Sea.
Thank you. I didn't fully answer. Those installations in the South China Sea are defensive. They're not there for the purpose of launching an attack. They may possibly be conceivably able to be used that way, but their purpose is to push back against the American presence. The result is, which is what the Chinese wanted to achieve, that the United States no longer has military supremacy in the Western Pacific. There's a buffer there, and that can only be a good thing.
Go ahead.
You go.
In international relations, we have something called security dilemma. You know that every country is spending for defense, or intention to build something on defense may be considered offensive by the others. And this time, I think the question refers to more the security of the other countries in South China Sea, not United States, like Philippines, Vietnam. They protest China's military expansion in South China Sea.
Well, they protest with mixed voices. Mm-hmm. The Philippines, Vietnam, all of those countries, who are some of the loudest voices, all want to coexist with China. They don't want to have a confrontation. The best enunciation of the approach, the most sensible approach in Southeast Asia, is that of the Singapore Prime Minister. You know, he says we have to live together, we have to coexist. It's not a case of confronting and defeating. It's a case of working with each other and accepting what we can. You know, but none of those Southeast Asian countries, and I've written about this for the South China Morning Post, none of those Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries want a US-led confrontation with China in the area. They all want to find a way. And historically, and I come back to the history because it's something I've been looking at recently, that's always been the way of dealing with China. You can't pick a fight with a huge bear and expect to win. You have to work out a way of living with it and coexisting.
Of course, this would create a lot of probably questions regarding both East China Sea, the Senkaku dispute as well, and Spratly Island dispute. But I want to go back to the book for a few minutes now. And you talk in another chapter on unilateralism. And this is one of the most significant critique of US foreign policy, starting from probably the Bush era would be the with us or against us discourse would be probably one of the most important moment of this increasing unilateralism. And you mentioned the role of international organization and how United States is acting within the international organization very unilaterally. And World Health Organization, what would be your comment on the US position on World Health Organization since the beginning of the COVID crisis. You mentioned that United States withdrew from that, but since then, United States come back to the organization. And do you think now Biden administration is going back to Paris Climate Agreement, going back to World Health Organization? Do you think is it something that would stop the retreat?
Yes, I think there'll be a number of reversals by the Biden administration, but there is a problem that I perceive, and that is that the United States, for a long time now, has never really trusted the multilateral organizations of the UN. Mm-hmm. It's never it's never been prepared to place its trust wholly in them. One example is the International Criminal Court. The United States will not have anything to do with it, whilst almost all other civilized countries do. And another example, a more concrete example, is the International Court of Justice. Mm-hmm. When little Nicaragua, won a case against the United States in the International Court of Justice in the 1980s, the United States was so upset with that decision, couldn't believe it, that it refused to recognize it. It took steps to try to prevent it being enforced and recognized in the UN, and behaved as if it was not prepared to accept the ruling of the umpire. And I don't, and you see that, you see small examples of that now. For example, within a very short time, 24 or 48 hours after the World Health Organization report into the origins of the COVID-19 virus, the United States led a whole group of countries who'd obviously been preparing for this beforehand to issue a report saying the report's not satisfactory, or the report's not reliable, or the investigators were not given adequate information. So there's an unwillingness to accept that the principle which the United States established and was at the head of establishing in 1945 requires recognition that we are all equals, and that the 193 countries all have the same say and the same sovereign rights. The problem is that in 1945, there were only 50 member countries of the United Nations, and they were nearly all allies or supporters of the United States. And as that has changed over the years, the attitude of Washington has changed as well.
There is this note that I just received. Apparently, the World Health Organization chief also asked for more transparency for the next reports about the origins of COVID.
Yes.
He didn't join the US and other countries, but I think he was also a little bit skeptical about the report. There is another question now. Çiğdem Dilek Aflakı asked this question. You have said that the biggest difference of today's world is the rise of China as a serious competitor to the US. What about the rise of regional powers and regionalism? What about the projections regarding the emergence of a kind of multipolar or multiplex world order?
Yes, well, I think a multipolar world is where we are heading. Mm-hmm. China and the United States are the two biggest players, but China seems to be content for there to be a multipolar world. It doesn't want global dominance. The United States is less content to allow that to happen. It wishes to retain the global supremacy that it has always strived to achieve.
Do you think, do you see any regional powers that may try to dominate or become a regional hegemon in different regions, in Europe, in Middle East, in Asia?
I don't see it in Asia. I think India is the next largest power, but it doesn't have hegemonic ambitions. Mm-hmm. I don't think Japan has hegemonic ambitions either. And I think the ASEAN nations are all very pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And I think there's no rising power in Africa or in South America with hegemonic ambitions. In Europe, if you include Russia, I don't think Russia has hegemonic ambitions. It's under President Putin. It's very unhappy with American hegemony and does as much as it can to undermine that. But it doesn't have the size and the scale or the intention to exercise hegemonic ambitions.
And before we skip to the last part of the book about Asia, really about Asia, there are a lot of, yesterday, U.S. Intelligence Director of National Intelligence announced its Worldwide Threat Assessment Report. And both in the Interim National Security Strategy document of the Biden administration and Worldwide Threat Assessment Report, we see slight difference compared to previous ones in the fact that in Intelligence, Director of National Intelligence Report, it was China is called as near peer competitor. Whereas in National Security Strategy document, Russia was calling as a big disruptor. And in this, it was called as Russian, there's only part about Russian provocative actions. So there wasn't any definition of it, of what kind of challenge Russia posed for the US. And when we read this, one of the things that comes to forward is about both Russia and China, there is this concern about the cyber attacks. And SolarWinds is about Russia is the most prominent one. How would you characterize that? Do you think, is it a real threat, or do you think it is inflated to deal with that?
Well, first of all, I agree that Russia is a disruptor. And when I say peer competitor, that doesn't mean a military antagonist, it just means a peer competitor.
It will flex its muscle technologically, and it will lead to becoming a military power. Would you agree with this or not?
I don't think it applies in every case. Mm-hmm. I really don't. And I think, we tend to look at things through a very short lens. But mm-hmm. Once again, southwest to Tibet, in the southeast to North Vietnam, personality as well. I don't think an adventurous approach to global affairs that we have seen over the last 75 years from Washington.
Final part of your book, let's on Asia. Sometimes some of the statistics show that it is extremely, like they have a lot of problems to resolve. They have good poverty reduction rate, but there is a lot of problem. Most of those countries can be in middle income trap, competing with other countries technologically, having that leap in the near future. So you argue that the future is Asia. I think it was both in your introduction at the last chapter, last paragraph of your introduction, and in your conclusion of the book as well. So why would you think that? And you mentioned that there is domestic stability in these countries. Do you think, Europe has domestic, Europe may say that they have domestic stability as well. What kind of data you have other than maybe the economic growth rate or some other statistics that shows that Asia is on the rise and it will be an Asian century?
Well, let me answer you first by taking an easy option.
Yeah.
The most eloquent, more eloquent than me, exponents of this view are writers you probably know. Parag Khanna and Mahbubani. Yeah. And they are, this is their life's work.
Yeah.
The proposition which both of them advance and with which I agree is that in East Asia and India, generally speaking, the populations can see growing economic prosperity and an increasing opportunity for economic advancement and generational improvement. They can see that the future is brighter than it used to be. The United States, I hate to keep coming back to it, and I quoted some figures about this, is in a position now where the average working class person in the United States has never had it so bad. Mm-hmm. in terms of the parity of wages compared to economic growth and the wages and the incomes of the elite. That's why people talk about the great worry of the increasing inequality across the United States. It's frankly, it's a pattern which we've seen before in history, and it's a recipe for future problems. So the short answer, I'm afraid to say, is simply that in East Asia and including India, the people of those countries, the citizens of those countries, can see the future, and the future is brighter for them.
Mm-hmm. So you may recall Goldman Sachs has this acronym BRIC. Brasilia, Russia, India, and China would be the most dominant economic powers in the next couple of decades. And I think since then, the Goldman Sachs may change its idea. Some of those countries, especially Brazil, I think, and Russia, is not on that list anymore. So do you think that, and in these kind of perspectives, there may be a challenge? You may recall the book of Professor Kennedy when he talked about that in 1990s, Japan will be the superpower, right? Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. Yes. And we had that problem at that point. He was expecting Japan to make that leap. And since now, it has been probably the rise of China books have been present in the literature at least 20 years now. And China is rising. But do you think would there be a problem just like Japan faced, right, in 1990s to China or other Asian countries? Do you think that Goldman Sachs list would be, like the nowhere to see in the next couple of decades?
Well, things have changed even since I wrote my book. The COVID crisis has affected Brazil more than was expected. And you mentioned Japan. It just reminds me that in the 1960s, everyone was complaining that, especially Washington was complaining that Japan was stealing its technology.
Of course.
Nothing is ever new. Everything's repeated. Look, things are moving fast, and this is 2020 has been a watershed year, and we can see that very clearly with Brazil. I'm not so sure how it's affected Russia, but yes, there'll be constant reassessment. My point is rather broader than that. It's just that the unstoppable force is the scale of numbers and the fact of peace, security, and prosperity, which gives everyone hope in most of Asia. Of course, Western Asia is a disaster zone, and we know why it's a disaster zone. And as soon as, and I note that this is the 20th, there's an announcement today of the withdrawal of US military forces from Afghanistan. But the countries of Western Asia won't revert to normality and prosperity for some decades yet, and it will involve the further withdrawal of US forces from those countries.
Michael, thank you very much for your time, and it was an interesting conversation. Probably I think the book is just published, so probably it would create a lot of controversies, because when I was reading the book, I could see who would respond how to some parts of your book, because there has been a lot of literature right now, even now actually emerging with the Biden administration, that America is back literature. right?
Yes.
So you write America in retreat, but people are talking about US is back. So we will see how your book basically fits into that discussion. And thank you for being part of this discussion today. And
Thank you,
for your
Kilic.
time.
Thank you. My pleasure.